protest the right way. You know, I was joking with my husband. I was like, why didn't they protest the right way? Right? Because the whole thing with like the NFL is like, why aren't they protesting the right way? There is not a right way to protest. Like for it to be effective, it has to be to a degree disruptive. You know, so it's yeah, yeah.
Good to see you, man. I haven't seen you all since.
So,
I know. Are you okay now?
yep,
Oh, that's tough, man. You got
yep.
no. This floor is
No, my mom is here though. Yeah, she's over in like the red top and the with the red top and the blazer. Oh yeah, we. Yeah. Oh, okay, awesome. I didn't know, but that's great. Yeah. So my husband and my daughter will join us for lunch, and my mom. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's fine. Yeah, Christian has been like, so where's the baby? I was like, I feel like this is like the only time that like I could. Yeah. So. Yeah. Yeah. Minus the storm. Yeah. Yeah. Or she might be wrecking shop like everywhere. So. Yeah. Man, I was thinking maybe he would come. All right. Let me compose it.
Hey,
It's starting to snow.
Uh-oh.
is it really?
You want to go ahead?
Sure.
Good.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's colloquium. We won't have a colloquium next week because of spring break, but the week after, Matheus Gatto will be speaking on the fear of slavery in Brazil. But please now welcome to the podium Professor William Julius Wilson. He's Professor of African American Studies and Sociology and University Professor and a lot of things.
One of the things I am is chair of the Du Bois Fellowship Selection Committee. And since I've read all of your applications, I know I am addressing an august body. And it is my pleasure to introduce one of your colleagues, Lafleur Stephens-Dougan. She is an assistant professor of politics at Princeton University, where she teaches courses in American politics and black politics in the post-civil rights era. Her research interests include public opinion, campaigns and elections, and racial attitudes. And prior to joining the Princeton faculty in 2014, she was a visiting scholar in the political science department at MIT. She received her doctorate in political science and public policy at the University of Michigan in 2013. Her dissertation, entitled The Effectiveness of Implicit and Explicit Racial Appeals, earned the American Political Science Association's Best Dissertation Award in Race and Ethnic Politics. Now, since then, she has contributed several significant publications to the field of political science, including such papers as quote, priming racial resentment without stereotypic cues, unquote, and, quote, the role of blacks in the presidential nomination process, unquote. And I had my assistant order print out both papers for me. I'm looking forward to reading them. And she also wrote a report for MDRC, the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, whose board I served on for 25 years. They do excellent evaluation research. And the title of that paper is, the challenge of that report is the challenge of scaling up educational reform, findings and lessons from First Things First. Another paper I'm going to look up and read. Now, she is completing her book-length project entitled Racing for Votes, How Candidates Use Racial Appeals to Win Elections in Majority White Jurisdictions. Making a lot of progress on that book.
Yeah, this year has been great for that.
Great,
so
great,
very
great,
thankful.
great. And she is a recipient of a National Science Foundation's Time-Sharing in Experimental Social Sciences Research Grant, as well as a grant from the Center for the Study of Public Policy in Diverse Societies. And I'm really looking forward to her talk entitled The Race for Votes, How Candidates Use Negative Racial Appeals About Blacks to Win White Votes. Please join me in welcoming Lafleur Stephens-Dougan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wilson, for that kind introduction. And I would also like to thank Skip, Abby, Krishna, the staff at the Hutchins Center, my fellows. This year has been just amazing, very productive, and it has given me a lot of space and time to think about my book-length project and to make progress on it as well. So just very thankful. And I would also say that I'd be remiss in not thanking my mom, who's in the audience today. She came to see my talk, and and I'm really excited. I'm really excited for her to be here so that she could hear what it is that I've been doing. And I'd also, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my husband. Both of them uprooted their lives to come with me to Cambridge for the academic year and provide childcare for a very active toddler. So I don't think the book could have made the amount of progress that I've made on the book without their help. Okay, so without any further ado. So when I tell people that I study how politicians use negative racial appeals to win the electoral support of white Americans, the conversation inevitably goes to President Trump. And with good reason. He launched his presidential campaign espousing anti-Mexican rhetoric, saying, quote, when Mexico sends their people, they are not sending their best. They are not sending you, they are not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. And while the president's rhetoric is often vile, racist, jingoist, xenophobic, I argue that to focus on President Trump is to go after the low-hanging fruit, thereby causing us to miss some of the more subtle ways in which candidates appeal to negative racial attitudes to secure the electoral support of some white Americans. The major thrust of my talk today, and of my book manuscript more broadly, is that politicians across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans, whites and blacks alike, use negative appeals about racial and ethnic minorities, often African Americans, to secure the electoral support of many white Americans. This is a theory that I'll explain in greater detail later in the talk, but first I want to give you an overview of what I will be talking about today. Okay, so the structure of today's presentation, I'm going to begin with the motivation for the talk, followed with a discussion of the theoretical framework. I'll sprinkle that with some examples from contemporary politics. And then I'll be discussing just one study from the book, which explores the question of, if explicit racial appeals are so ineffective, why do we continue to see them? Because the presuming wisdom, or the conventional wisdom, is that these types of appeals shouldn't actually work in a post-civil rights era. And then I will conclude with a summary of the findings from the talk. So to motivate the talk, I am going to begin with an ad which many of you might be familiar with. It's sort of become the quintessential example of a candidate injecting race into a political campaign.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Okay, so the ad that you just saw was the infamous weekend passes ad, more commonly known as the Willie Horton ad, whose actual name was William, by the way, or the ad that some of the Massachusetts locals might know as the ad that sunk the presidential prospects of former Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Right, so now, in some respects, this ad is a bit dated. Many people in this room are probably too young to remember the ad, and at the risk of dating myself, I was 8 years old when it aired. So some people might look at that ad and not really see anything problematic, right? So weekend passes criticized Dukakis for his record on crime. It made it clear that Dukakis, unlike George H.W. Bush, opposed the death penalty. And so on its face, what's wrong with that? But what if I told you that the weekend passes ad launched a whole line of inquiry in political science that shows that actually stereotypical imagery such as the Horton mugshot, or racially coded rhetoric such as talking about getting tough on crime or the inner city, actually activates many white Americans' negative racial attitudes about blacks. So much so that they're more likely to use those attitudes to determine their vote choices and political preferences than even other things such as whether they identify as a Democrat or a Republican, or as a liberal or a conservative. This is a phenomenon that's known as racial priming. Another interesting thing about that weekend passes advertisement is that while it has become the quintessential example of a Republican injecting race into a campaign, a lesser known fact, however, is that the first person to use the issue of the furlough program against Dukakis was actually Democrat Al Gore. During a 1988 Democratic presidential primary debate in New York, Gore, who was running a distant third behind Dukakis and Jesse Jackson, pointedly asked Dukakis about weekend passes for convicted criminals. In contrast to Bush's political strategists, to be fair, Gore never indicated that Horton was black, and he never mentioned Horton by name. However, raising the furlough issue was arguably an attempt for Gore, a Southern and more conservative Democrat, to associate Dukakis, a Northeastern and implicitly out-of-touch, soft-on-crime liberal, with the racialized issue of crime. As for the Bush campaign, after Dukakis clinched the Democratic nomination, Bush seized on the Horton incident, repeatedly bringing it up in campaign speeches. Lee Atwater, Bush's campaign manager, was even reported to have said, by the time we're finished, they're going to wonder whether Willie Horton is Dukakis' running mate. Despite the racial subtext of the ad, however, the Bush campaign vehemently denied that the ad exploited stereotypes of black criminality for political gain. The campaign also insulated itself from these charges by claiming that it had nothing to do with the weekend passes ad. However, as some of you might know, the campaign was later linked to the independent political action committee that produced the ad. So why rehash a now decades-old story about a commercial from the 1988 presidential election? I argue that the fallout around the weekend passes advertisement is illustrative of the scholarly and popular attention that tends to focus on white Republican politicians making appeals to prejudice while ignoring the incentives that exist for white Democratic candidates and candidates of color to also use voters' negative racial attitudes about blacks for political gain. While we tend to think of the Democratic Party as the racially progressive party and the Republican Party as the party of racial conservatism, I argue that both major parties are invested in attracting white electoral support, often to the point that they are willing to distance themselves from African Americans for political gain, often through the injection of negative racial stereotypes. So I'll be talking today about what I refer to as racial signals. And racial signals are simply communication that either implicitly or explicitly indicates that a politician or a party will not be beholden to racial and ethnic minorities. And we've seen evidence of this with respect to some of the rhetoric around Muslims, immigrants, Latinos, but for the purposes of my talk today, I'll be focusing on rhetoric specifically with respect to African Americans. And these types of signals can kind of run the gamut, but I'll be talking specifically about negative racial messaging, and that's messaging that emphasizes personal responsibility directed specifically at African Americans, often invoking stereotypes around the purported lack of work ethic among African Americans. So this begs the question, why are negative racial messages about Black people specifically so effective? Right, so one thing is that in the post-civil rights era, prejudice towards Blacks is often expressed as this sort of moral feeling that Blacks violate such traditional American values as individualism and self-reliance. It's this idea that, you know, Black people, they can't get it together, they won't just play by the rules and work hard like everyone else. Surveys routinely show that many white Americans perceive African Americans as less hardworking than whites. So it comes as no surprise that this can then be a politically effective tool for politicians to rely upon. So for example, 42% of white Republicans in 2016 were willing to say that they thought that Black people were on average less hardworking than their fellow white Americans. But lest we think that this is just a Republican phenomenon, about 28% of white Democrats were also willing to say this as well. So while we might see higher levels of racial conservatism among Republicans, this is not to suggest that the Democratic Party could be absolved of this as well. Okay, so I thought we could start with just a couple of examples from recent politics of how these racial signals or these negative racial messages are used. So this is Newt Gingrich. You guys might remember him. In 2012, when he was running for president, he said that he would accept an invitation to the NAACP National Annual Convention and tell Black people why they should demand paychecks instead of being satisfied with food stamps. Another candidate who was running in 2012 is Rick Santorum. He told a mostly white crowd in Iowa that he didn't want to make Black people's lives better by giving them someone else's money. He wanted to give them the opportunity to go out and earn money. How benevolent. So thus far, I've shown you examples from 2 white Republican candidates, but what about Black Republicans? You guys might also remember Herman Cain, and when he ran in 2012, he said several outlandish things, but for today's talk, you might remember that he said that African Americans were not held back because of racism. He argued that people sometimes hold themselves back because they want to use racism as an excuse for them not being able to achieve what they want to achieve. But recall, I said that this is not solely a Republican phenomenon. So what about Hillary Clinton? You might remember during her 2008 presidential bid, in an interview with USA Today, she relied on the tired trope of lazy African Americans by contrasting her support from white Americans relative to Obama's lack of support from whites. Citing a poll from the Associated Press, she said how the poll found that Senator Obama's support among working, hard-working Americans, white Americans, is weakening again. Clinton rejected the notion that her comments were racially divisive,
But arguably, her comments played to the stereotype of Black people being lazy by equating white Americans with hardworking Americans. Now, this one's not so much a negative racial message, but I just like to throw this one out here. This is Harold Ford, a Black Democrat who was running for to represent Tennessee in the U.S. Senate in 2006, and this is sort of a more implicit or perhaps explicit way, I think, of also appealing to negative racial attitudes. Now, the next one I might catch a little flack for, but I think it's worthy of discussion. So in a speech before the 2008 Texas primary, President Obama, or then Senator Obama, chastised Black parents for feeding their children cold Popeyes fried chicken for breakfast. And in an address to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation in 2012, he told the predominantly Black audience to, quote, "Take off your bedroom slippers, put on your marching shoes, shake it off, stop complaining, stop grumbling, stop crying." Obama's personal responsibility messages to Black audiences had become so commonplace at one point that he had earned the nickname the Scold of Black America. After the remarks to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Representative Maxine Waters said, "I'm not sure who the president was addressing. I found that language a bit curious because the president spoke to the Hispanic caucus, and certainly they're pushing him on immigration, and despite the fact that he's appointed Sotomayor to the Supreme Court, he has an Office for Excellence for Hispanic Education right in the White House. They're still pushing him. He certainly didn't tell them to stop complaining." And while I'm not saying that Obama's rhetoric is equivalent to that of a Newt Gingrich or a Rick Santorum, I am saying that messages that inject negative stereotypes about Black work ethic are an enduring part of American politics, literally baked into the social fabric. And so these types of appeals are an effective means of drumming up white electoral support, even for candidates who would not traditionally attract the support of racially conservative whites. I also argue that candidates who are seen as too closely associated with Blacks or Black interests have traditionally not fared well in American politics, and so therefore, candidates across the political spectrum are incentivized to distance themselves from Blacks. For white Republican candidates, they're incentivized to highlight their party's reputational strength for racial conservatism, right? So we have stereotypes about the two major parties, and they're known as the party of racial conservatism. And so for many whites, that's an attractive thing. White Democratic candidates and African-American candidates of either party, however, are incentivized to play against type or to try to disrupt the stereotype that they are beholden to racial and ethnic minorities. And what I'm saying departs from a lot of the previous research on these negative racial appeals. So it's traditionally thought that in the post-civil rights era, most people are going to reject any sort of explicit references to race, anything that would openly use a racial noun such as Mexican or African American. And these types of appeals are seen as almost universally violating what's known as the norm of racial equality, or the prohibition against racist speech. Conventional wisdom is that if a candidate uses an explicit appeal, they will inevitably lose support. And so the expectation is that a candidate should use more racially coded or implicit rhetoric to appeal to sort of these negative racial predispositions. So that's where you hear things like, again, that rhetoric around maybe like the inner city or being the law and order candidate. Those would be more implicit attempts to appeal to negative racial predispositions. Previous research would also say that Democrats and Black candidates of either party should adopt what's known as a strategy of deracialization. So this would be the idea that they should avoid any discussion of racialized issues such as welfare and affirmative action, and stick to those things that have a broader appeal, such as healthcare, although we've seen how healthcare in recent years has also become racialized, but things like healthcare or the economy. And it's the idea that they should really just stay away from race. They lose when they talk about race. But I argue that's actually a little more nuanced, that these candidates can talk about race, but they need to do so in a way that signals that their politics are not that of a Reverend Al Sharpton or a Jesse Jackson. Basically, that they're not too racially liberal. It's traditionally thought, though, that the Democratic Party's strategy is silence and evasion, and that for the Republican Party, that they just need to use racial code words without appearing racist. But I think there are some reasons why we might reconsider some of this previous research. Most of it has only been tested in the context of white messengers. So we often use, in political science, these survey experiments to test the effectiveness of these types of appeals. But traditionally, the source cue is a white candidate. But we don't know about often these negative messages coming from people other than white, often white Republican candidates. People may be more willing to adhere to social norms in the context of a white messenger. And so it's important to see how they behave when the messenger is not white. That is to say that people who are concerned with self-presentation or being socially desirable might be more willing to sanction what's considered racist or problematic speech when the messenger is a white Republican, but less willing to do so when the candidate is even a white Democrat or a black candidate. And also, as we noted earlier, a non-trivial sum of the population thinks that African Americans violate traditional American values of work ethic and self-reliance. Excuse me. Another reason why we might reconsider the racial priming theory is this idea that only Nixon could go to China, right? So the idea that people who are seen as speaking against their own self-interest or the group interest are seen as more credible and more effective. So in this case, a black candidate, for example, speaking out against African Americans might be more sort of politically palatable for many people. So I offer what I refer to as my theory of racial signaling, and it's the idea that candidates are rewarded for not catering to the interest of racial and ethnic minorities, but they must also show that they are not racially insensitive. I'm sorry, I actually think that's my phone. Constraints, however, vary depending on a candidate's race and partisanship. So basically, you have more latitude depending on both the combination of your race and party to use these appeals, but like I said, we've often been focusing on the use of these appeals by perhaps, maybe not so much so more, the group most likely to be constrained, which would be white Republicans. Okay, so in light of this theory, I test several hypotheses in this particular study. The first being that implicit appeals are more effective than explicit appeals when the candidate is white. So that would be in keeping with the theory of racial priming or the racial priming hypothesis. That's what we would expect. But when the candidate is black, white voters will not distinguish between the two types of appeals. So in other words, there's not going to be a penalty associated with a black candidate using the open racial nouns like black or African American. Hypothesis 2 is that self-monitors are more comfortable supporting candidates who use negative racial messaging when the candidate is not a white Republican. So in other words, they would be more willing to sanction a white Republican if they're high in self-monitoring relative to other types of candidates with the equivalent type of message. Third, black Democratic candidates who deploy negative racial messages or personal responsibility messages to black people will fare better than other black Democratic candidates who do not. And I mean in terms of electoral support. Okay, so to test these hypotheses, I conducted a survey experiment on a nationally diverse sample of 2,400 white Americans via the internet. And so people can opt in to take surveys via the internet by virtue of being able to take it in the privacy of one's own home or on one's tablet or computer. This helps to decrease any concerns around social desirability or people maybe trying to say things that are politically correct, for example, in the presence of an interviewer. And I could get into some of the more methods behind it, but it's a nationally diverse sample. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's nationally representative, but it does pretty well on many of the key demographics that we care about. Subjects were randomly assigned to one of 16 conditions, and I manipulated the race of the candidate, so the candidate's depicted as either African American or white, the partisanship of the candidate, so they're depicted as a Democrat or a Republican, and the type of message. And I can say a little bit more about the messages in a bit. And they were randomly assigned to read an article about a candidate who was running for governor who recently gave a speech about education. And so, without going into too many of the technical details, the benefits of an experiment with random assignment is that I'm able to tightly control the conditions so that any sort of impact that we see in terms of vote choice or preferences, we know is a result of the treatment. So you can even take it back to thinking of like, my favorite elementary school science fair project, which was to put one plant in the closet and put the other on the windowsill, right? So the treatment is light, and we see how the plant performs with getting light. In this case, the treatment is literally the article that people read. Of the sample, it was 40%, and I should note, it's an all-white sample. I would have liked to include African-American respondents, but it's prohibitively expensive for me at this point, but maybe in another iteration of the project. So 40% of the sample identified as Democrats, 18% as independents, and 42% as Republicans. The median household income was between $60,000 to $69,999. Female or women were slightly overrepresented at 56%. It's 31% people residing in the South, and 34% of the sample had a bachelor's degree or higher. Okay, so people were exposed, like I said. I manipulated the partisanship, so you can see here that it says Democratic candidate speaks at education forum. There's a white version of this. You can see that this candidate is depicted as white, this candidate is depicted as African American. I use the same picture across all of the treatments, and you can see that they're comparable in terms of like the stance, attractiveness, age, all of the things that might potentially affect how people perceive the article. And the article simply, Democratic Assemblyman Michael Harris announced last week that he will be running for governor this year. Harris is running to replace the current governor whose governorship will end because of term limits. Harris has already started campaigning. Last night he made a stop at an education forum where he gave a speech outlining his plan for the state's education policy. The initiative is called Vision 2025. Recent polls suggest that education will be one of the most important issues for voters in the state. The Democratic candidate is expected to be a major contender in the race. Harris is a Yale-educated lawyer who has been active on a variety of issues, including sponsoring major legislation during his time in the state legislature. He also has a reputation for being a straight-talking politician who's not afraid to speak his mind. So now this tells you something without really telling you much. That's the idea of this control condition. We want to make sure that people are exposed. We can get a sense of what their baseline attitudes are to this candidate without too much meaningful information, but they know that that he's been active on a variety of issues, that he sponsored major legislation. And of course I'm not presenting the Republican versions of the treatments, but basically wherever it says Democrat, you'd insert Republican for those versions of the treatments. Okay, next we have a deracialized condition. And this is, I will say, not deracialized completely in the traditional sense. It does avoid any mention of welfare or affirmative action. It's the same article as the control, but with the addition of one paragraph. Right, and so it says, Harris's speech focused largely on the role of parenting in improving educational outcomes. The Democratic candidate told the audience parents are responsible for their children failing to achieve in school. If parents would work harder, communities would be more successful. I'm tired of people blaming the government for problems that they created. People need to learn the value of hard work harder. Now, there's an argument to be made that maybe there's some implicit racial language around work ethic or hard work, but I'm calling this a deracialized treatment because there's no sort of what I would consider technically racially coded rhetoric, and of course there's no open mentions to any specific racial group. In the implicit version, they get basically the same thing as the deracialized message, but instead of just referring to parents, they refer to inner city parents and inner city parenting. So again, it's implicitly racial because no one's actually saying Black people specifically, but previous research has shown that people associate the term inner city with African Americans. And then finally, the explicit versions of the treatments say openly Black parents are responsible, Black parents need to, basically all the same language, but with the insertion of Black. After people saw or read the articles, they were asked a variety of questions, including their likely vote for their candidate, measures of their racial resentment, perceptions of zero-sum politics, self-monitoring, and open-ended questions about their likes and dislikes about the candidate. I'll say a little bit more about some of these measures. So racial resentment is a metric that is traditionally used in political science research. There's some controversy around it, but people are basically asked the degree to which they strongly agree or disagree with the following statements. So generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. It's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they would be just as well off as whites. Over the past few years, Blacks have gotten less than they deserve. Irish, Italians, Jewish, and many other minorities work their way up without any special favors. Blacks should do the same. Sure. But slavery is a thing of the past.
It compounds it, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, that's a fair point, but it's also a metric that I didn't develop. So it's a metric, yeah, it's a metric that's commonly used in the literature, but I'll show you later that I get pretty comparable results with different metrics of negative racial towards Blacks. Also, what's controversial about this particular metric is that some people would argue that it's capturing just principled conservatism, so some be conservative. But I will say that the scale has traditionally done a remarkably good job of predicting on racial policy specifically. Okay, so a little bit more about this. So basically, the takeaway with this particular metric is that if you score over a 0.5 on it, then you'd be considered what's considered racial conservative. If you're below a 0.5, you'd be considered a racial liberal. The average for this particular sample was a 0.56, which means that the average respondent was a racial conservative, although not perhaps highly racially conservative. And this is actually a little bit lower than most national surveys. I'm not quite sure why it's as low in this particular sample. And the median was a 0.625, which means that 50% of the sample had a racial resentment score over a 0.625. So we're talking about a sample that in which racial liberals are a decided minority, and that's pretty typical of the American public, generally speaking. Most Americans, by this particular metric, would be considered racial conservatives. Most white Americans, I should say, sorry. I also included a measure of people's perception of zero-sum politics. They basically were just asked to the degree to which they agreed with the statement, more influence for Blacks in politics means less influence for whites in politics. They were asked some open-ended questions about what they liked or disliked about the candidate. What did you like about the candidate? What did you dislike about the candidate? I also asked, there's other things, I'm just talking about a couple. The self-monitoring scale. This is a scale developed by psychologists that captures basically the degree to which people care about self-presentation or what other people think about them. So the idea being here that people who are high self-monitors might be less willing to endorse racially problematic or racially conservative statements depending on who is saying it. Most notably when the person espousing the message is a white Republican. Okay, so the first result that we'll look at is just a simple tally of racist mentions by candidate. So along the bottom basically are the different versions of the article that people were exposed to. These are the control versions, and I just tallied, just a quick and dirty count of how many times in those open-ended questions did people refer to the candidate as racist or as bigoted, any sort of language like that. So you can see, like, in the control, there's no reason for them really to identify the candidate as racist. What's especially interesting is that for the explicit white Republican message, about a quarter of the responses referred to the candidate in some way as a racist. A black Republican with the equivalent message was less likely to be referred to as racist. The white Democrat does get some racist mentions, but really just the takeaway point here is that people are putting a different lens or interpretation to the same identical language depending on who's saying it. And I think in part because of some of our some of the things associated with the Republican Party and white Republican candidates in particular, people are maybe a little more quick to call them out on racism. Okay, so then in the next slide, I present the results for testing the racial priming hypothesis. And so earlier I mentioned that traditionally we think that explicit appeals, those that openly use racial references, should result in a loss in electoral support relative to those that are implicit. So for the white Republican candidate, you see that that does maintain, that's the case. People are less likely to vote for the white Republican with that message. The same goes for the white Democratic version, and these differences are statistically significant at least the 0.05 level. But for the black Democratic candidate, you can see that the difference in support is actually a lot smaller, and people are actually more willing to vote for a black Democrat with the explicit message. These fall short of statistical significance though, but the main takeaway point is that they're not being punished for the explicit message. And the same goes for the black Republican counterpart. Okay, so I look at the impact of self-monitoring on the explicit messages. And along the x-axis here is the self-monitoring scale. So at a 0, you'd be a very low self-monitor. You don't care about self-presentation or social desirability. People at a 1 care very much about that. Of interest here is really the line representing the white Republican with the explicit message. You can see that for people who are high on self-monitoring, oh, I should also note, sorry, that the y-axis is the predicted vote for the candidate. And so that goes from 0 to 100. The scaling's a little off, but the takeaway is that really for people who are high in self-monitoring, they are much less likely to vote for the white candidate, with the white Republican candidate with the explicit message relative to any of the other messages. Also interesting is for, say for example, like the white Dem with the explicit message, or the black Republican with the explicit message, all of these others, the lines are a lot, the slope is basically a lot more flat. And so most of the action is happening here with respect to the white Republican. Okay, next I look at likely vote for black Democratic candidates. with the different types of messages. Along the x-axis is the perception of zero-sum politics. These are people who think more influence for blacks in politics means less influence for whites. These people disagree with that statement. And what we see here is for the control condition, interestingly, if you think that politics is a zero-sum game, just seeing the black candidate with that baseline message, you're much less willing to vote for them. But when you get exposed to the black candidate with that explicit message that implicates black parenting and black responsibility, your likelihood of voting for the candidate basically goes from roughly like the low 20s to about 80. So hearing a message from a black Democrat that implicates African Americans in particular, if you're high on zero-sum politics, increases your likelihood of voting for the candidate. The same pattern holds true for racial resentment. So if you're high on racial resentment, and you see the control, you're less willing to vote for that candidate, but you get that explicit message or even the implicit message, and you're much more likely to vote for that candidate relative to the control. I also have a metric of people's perceived, this should be actually, sorry, their racial liberalism, not their favoritism, but as a function of people's level of racial resentment. And again, the takeaway here is that when a candidate uses a message that invokes personal responsibility rhetoric around African Americans, people are less likely to see them as racially liberal. So to the extent that being racially liberal might be perceived as a bad thing in politics when trying to attract white electoral support, it suggests that these personal responsibility messages do a good job of depressing that perception. So in summary, I was able to show that the racial priming hypothesis does not hold when the candidate is depicted as African American. So this is very different than much of the previous research that has just focused on white candidates as the source of these messages. We also saw that self-monitors are more comfortable supporting candidates who use negative racial messaging when the candidate is not a white Republican. So people who care about what others think about them are much more willing to punish that type of message when it's a white Republican. Black Democratic politicians receive more electoral support from racially conservative whites when they use those negative racial messages relative to the control. And in terms of the implications of these results in future research, I would argue that candidates who inject negative racial stereotypes about blacks do so because types of messages work, frankly. And it also suggests that parties may be incentivized to field racially conservative candidates of color because they can do so perhaps without generating as much of a backlash. And black politicians who are running for support in majority white jurisdictions may be inclined to use some of these types of messages to curry favor from some racially resentful white voters. And so I'll conclude there, and I can open the floor for questions.
Hello, you're kidding. Lafleur, that was great. Bill, would you like to begin? Larry?
I guess thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and I'm interested to see how you're fleshing this out. One is kind of a smaller technical question, and that is, why ask racial resentment after you've done the experimental manipulations?
Okay, so again, this was an issue largely of budget. So traditionally, I would prefer to have had a pretest where these attitudes were measured with some lag time, maybe like 3 days, a week, and then people get exposed to the treatment and then are asked after. But given sort of just the constraints, I had to do it in a single shot survey, but I have basically a comparable study where I was able to do basically a pre and a post test, and the results are quite comparable. The only difference with that study is that I only look at Black Democrats versus white Democrats. And I think, there's some research to suggest in the literature that those racial attitudes are fairly stable. So, although it would have been my preference to asking the
Although given that you're interested in priming in a way, if they've already, some people get primed by the experimental stimulus before they get to an assessment of their racial attitudes. So
True.
the problem then becomes you're confounding what you're going to use as kind of a key independent measure with the experimental manipulation. I mean, that's the catch with it coming after the experiment.
Okay, if I'm following that line of thinking correctly, then I would argue then that we shouldn't see, if anything, I'm probably depressing the results of, or the impact of the racial resentment, because if people are already primed to if people are already primed and I'm still finding a priming effect, perhaps that suggests that.
No, it says that the people who get the racial manipulation are getting a more racialized set of questions than people who didn't.
But everyone gets the racialized questions.
Well, I mean, think about it. But
Okay.
the second question concerns how to understand, in a broader sense, the role of race and racism in American politics. And I want to go back to the Obama case, not so much to defend Obama, which my friend Skip knows I'll do. And I was glad. I was glad to see that you remembered the very negative racial things his friend Hillary Clinton has done.
Yes. Well, I was excited when I saw you come in because we've discussed some of this.
Although we could have had a footnote on Geraldine Ferraro, who really did the ugly work for Clinton in 2008.
Right.
Obama is the affirmative action candidate. But it seems to me that there's a far more profound role of racism in American politics, so that even if you get, and let's say I accept this language, as a black candidate like Obama who implicitly appeals to negative racial messages being more viable, it doesn't save you from being trapped. And I mean that in the following sense, that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, becomes racialized, even if you do all that. And I don't know if you can speak to that as a diagnosis of a larger problem in American politics and what, if any, way out of that we may have. Because he certainly tried the universalistic strategy of packaging and appealing for this, but it didn't stick.
But he did a poor job, Larry.
Well, no, but we can debate that, but it didn't stick, is the question.
And he did a poor job. No, he did a poor job selling the Affordable Care.
Okay, well, I
agree, but Bobo, the next to me will beat me up.
I would argue, or I guess I would agree, that he did a poor job selling the Affordable Care Act, but I think he did a pretty good job as packaging it as universal. But I think this speaks to Professor Bobo's larger point about, in the case of Obama, a black candidate, basically anything that he touched became racialized. And so when I use him as an example, or even other black candidates, we can point to like Michael Nutter from Philadelphia, former mayor of Philadelphia, for example. I'm not saying that these candidates, I'm speaking to just kind of the political realities that they face. So I should also be clear that I'm not advocating a particular strategy here. I'm just an objective researcher trying to see like how these messages affect vote choice. But I think it speaks to the problems for our democratic, small d, democratic politics in terms of potentially for a black candidate to win office in a majority white jurisdiction, that they have to some degree, maybe distance themselves from African Americans or from black interests, right? So it's troubling in that respect. And then just the constraints that he as a candidate faced, both. But I will say, so you talk about the Affordable Care Act and what he did once he was in office, but I guess one is a governing strategy and one is an electoral strategy, and it was at least, I mean, I'm not using Obama as the specific case, but one could argue that it was effective in terms of electoral politics, but maybe less so in terms of governance.
Good. Questions, comments? Mary, you want to follow up? No, I'm good. Okay.
Hi.
Thank you very much. I have a question about why you use the term racial liberal and racial conservative for what seems like racial prejudice.
I'm just using the literature, I mean the language that's used in the discipline and the literature, and we typically refer to these people as racial conservatives versus racial liberals. And I also think, honestly, I think actually I get some pushback for even the idea of racial conservatism or racial liberalism in some of these discussions when I've given these talks. So I think to ratchet up the language to a discussion of prejudice or even, dare I say, like racism would be too polarizing in many instances. And I think once that discussion gets started, you might lose some of the audience. So I just go with the discipline standards.
So this made me think about the way that it's generally expected for low-income, poor blacks to have a blind allegiance to the liberal agenda. And on one of the slides that was discussing Obama's appointment of the Supreme Court Justice and Maxine Waters, who I actually love, I agree with that comment 100%. But it made me think about the nuanced conversations beneath that, how, in a sense, we'll chastise the populace of black folks that aren't voting. Mm-hmm. And we'll condemn them publicly, like, oh, you aren't voting, this is why this is happening, this is why X, Y, Z is happening. But I think that this conversation kind of lays out the receipts for why people aren't voting. It's hard to support, even myself as a person that's a strategic voter, it's hard to continually, strategically support individuals that have supported mass incarceration on a widespread level, and the receipts just never are cashed in for who they truly are. So my question is rooted in how much of this do you believe, on the reverse side of the coin, how this may influence white folks to actually go vote? How much of this is influencing black folks to just say the hell with voting?
Oh, I see. So in terms of this type of rhetoric?
Yeah.
I mean, I have some data that I don't present here, which shows that it can be a demobilizing factor for black voters, but I would also argue that many black voters, I don't think, see themselves implicated in that message. So, and to a degree, many of them might also agree with that type of message. So like black people are not immune from thinking like, oh, black people need to parent better, or black people, you know, whatever, need to not feed their kids fried chicken for breakfast or something, right? So black people, many black people would agree with that message as well. And so I guess my point here is that it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily make things go bad for a black candidate or a Democratic candidate who espouses that type of message because many African Americans would also agree with that type of messaging as well.
Okay, so given the threat of Donald Trump, coalition politics are more important than ever. And so what does your research suggest for how messages can be crafted to enhance the effectiveness of coalition politics?
Yeah, so I don't think, I'm going to be careful here. So the deracialized message that I presented here still had a message of, sort of working hard. And it didn't implicate race specifically, but you could see from the results that the messages that either talked implicitly or explicitly about blacks specifically were more popular. So that to me says that there's a particular taste or preference for messages of telling black people, like, you need to pull it together. And so that does not necessarily make me, at least with respect to those results, that hopeful about a de-racialized or a universalistic message. Now, that's not a true universalistic message that I presented, because I had to keep them as comparable as I could across conditions to be able to say what was doing the work or the change. I have another study. It's more of like a message around getting out the vote. And it's like, we can all come together and we all need to vote. But that message relative to black people, you need to go out and vote, is also less effective. So I maybe am a bit pessimistic in terms of the universal message, which I know you're a fan of universalism, but at least from the data that I have at hand, I haven't
can I just
seen
say
it be as
something?
effective.
I think that a universal message that does not address the issue of race is not going to be very effective. But you can have universal messages, that is to say, that reach out to all groups, but also addresses the specific issue of race as well. And it's how you frame these things. It's so important to frame these things in a way that the messages resonate with blacks, resonate with whites, resonate with folks who feel marginalized, And I'm sorry, I don't want to get on my... Democrats are not doing that, and that's what worries me.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. That's right. You want to give an amen to that, or?
I'm going to just hold my peace.
When does race become class? You said, first of all, there are 42 million African Americans, so they can't all agree on everything.
Right.
And you also said a couple times in passing that, some members of the black community like that message too. Right. Like whatever Barack's thing was, take off your bedroom slippers and put on your... How do you account for that? Differences. We are all guilty of totalizing the black community, but, how long you been black? I mean, everybody who's black knows that the black community is very diverse. If you go to a barbershop or a beauty parlor, you just sit, some people agree with this stuff, and they're not racist, and they're not Ben Carson, and they're not, or Clarence Thomas. They're just good black people who would call themselves race women and race men, but who were conservative on some issues and liberal on the other.
Right.
So how does that break down with...
So I would argue that for many African Americans, they do agree and they would endorse those messages. But in part, we know in the post-civil rights era, there's also sort of a bifurcation where you have some African Americans who are doing much better and have achieved, great achievements in terms of education and income and all of the sort of metrics on that. But you also have a significant portion who's becoming further and further isolated. And so when I hear that, or when I think that some black people are receptive to those messages, I think it's largely because they don't see themselves as implicated in those messages. It is a class story to a degree. So this is a story of maybe you made it out of XYZ predicament or out of public housing or whatever the case may be, but you see this as a message that is needed for maybe your cousins who haven't made it, or you know, black people you know who you don't think are working hard and playing by the rules. So in part, it can be a bit of a
Do we have any numbers? I mean, do we have any statistics like this ad, Barack Obama's speech was appealed to 20% of the black community, but 80% thought it was, you know, a mistake or something like that. I'm just making up the example.
Sure. I know that there's a study that looks at like out of Columbia that I think asks like, who do black people think this message was intended to appeal to? And they also ask white people who they think the message was intended to appeal to. And I think, if I don't want to misquote it, but I want to say that white people were more likely to think that the message was intended to appeal to them, whereas blacks were more likely to think that the message was intended to appeal to black people. But I think there's also sort of a barbershop or beauty shop conversation that's also going on where people will say, well, you know, he's just saying these things, whoever the candidate is, not just Obama, he's just saying these things to get elected. We know that he has to do this to get elected, and once he gets elected, you know, he'll look out for our interests. And, you know, that says something about the nature of our politics if perhaps that's maybe what a black candidate has to do to be successful.
I just had a quick footnote to that, and then other people should ask questions. But if you look at that racial resentment scale, so any one item, let's say the Italians, Jews, Irish got ahead without special favors, blacks should do the same things. You know, 70 to 78% of white Americans agree with that in national surveys. 50% of black Americans do. It's a pretty high number. But it has far less political effect among blacks than it does whites. And there are 2, maybe 3 reasons for it. First of all, for blacks, it's a membership category, right? Whites are talking about an out-group when they're responding. The blacks are talking about people like me. Art builds in a greater sense of both sympathy and self-interest in some sense into it, which doesn't exist on the white side of the equation. And secondly, an overwhelming fraction of African Americans would perceive discrimination as a real problem. Much higher fractions of blacks than is true among. So you get a white person affirming that point of view, denying that discrimination's an issue, and not seeing themselves as implicated. It's just got a whole different political outcome as a consequence of that array of considerations. And the real empirical test is the 98% of black folks who vote for Obama in 08 and the 93 to 95 who do it in 12. I mean, they saw the whole dance. And they go, there's some big uglier stuff out there than Barack Obama.
So this reminds me that in the last election, not talking about blacks now, but talking about immigrants, I was really disturbed when I learned that a number of immigrants, I'm talking about Latino immigrants, sort of believed what Trump was saying. They say, what Trump was saying doesn't apply to me. It applies to those other folks, you know. That problematic group that he's referring to doesn't apply to me. And believe me, the immigrant group, the Latino vote for Trump was very disturbing in the sense that it was too damn high. You know, so the very thing you're talking about with respect to some blacks, and look at the racial gap between the haves and have-nots, applies to Hispanics. And I just hope that somehow we got a lot at stake here, and so we got to start addressing some of these issues and getting out the Hispanic. By the way, Larry, isn't it true that the black vote is not so bad in terms of black turnout, but the Hispanic turnout is terrible?
Which was part of the problem of the campaign saying we're going after Latinos.
Yeah.
If they're in the wrong states, you're going to win California anyway.
Yeah.
And the registration rates are not as high, not nearly as high, and the turnout's even lower.
Yeah.
So, you know.
I'm sorry, but this gets us up, but your talk suggests a lot of things to consider.
If looking at pragmatically to 2020, if you were advising or a speechwriter for, say, Deval Patrick for president, how would you frame the discourse about race?
Oh, dear. Oh, I feel like that one might. If he had to frame that rhetoric, I think honestly what he could do is maybe some of what I think Professor Wilson was speaking to, which is I think the Democratic Party has maybe focused too heavily on this working class white vote that they seem to be sort of perpetually obsessed with after like these big losses, right? So every time there's a big loss, it's like, oh, like we did too much identity politics, we reached out to black people too much, or perhaps we reached out to Latinos too much. And rather than trying to kind of corral those votes with the message, there's still this sort of focus on trying to appeal to white voters, many of whom they've already lost. So I think a message that could get people of color excited and maybe along certain class issues that could get people mobilized that might appeal to some whites, but you know, there's things around like mass incarceration. Looks like healthcare might still continue to be an issue, jobs, and those are messages that could get, I think, a lot of people of color mobilized and excited, and maybe with less of this sort of, I hate to say, like fetish with trying to appeal to many whites who really don't see their interest aligned with the Democratic Party.
I'm sorry. Go for it, Bill. I gotta address that. So I remember in 1992 when Bill Clinton was running for office the first time. I was on watching C-SPAN, and he would go into a white church, a black church, first of all, and he would say something like, you know, they think we're fools. They want us to turn on each other, race against race, and recognize that the problem is failed economic policies and failed political policies. They think we're stupid. We don't know this. And we end up, they want us to turn on each other instead of recognizing these failed political policies, these failed economic policies that are killing all of us. Then he goes into a white church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with the same message. And just like the blacks stood up and clapped, the whites in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, stood up and clapped. And that's what I mean, that the Democrats and Deval Patrick or whoever's running has got to sort of develop a kind of populist message that resonates, that makes people recognize that we depend on one another, that these politicians out there are trying to trick us, they're trying to fool us, they're trying to get us to turn against each other, when we should recognize that we're all in a sinking boat and there's a sense of interdependence and we can't get ahead without the help of these other groups. That's the kind of message that needs to get out there. But we're not doing it. You know, it's interesting. Have you wondered why it is that Obamacare now has the support of 60% of the American population? They don't, look, a lot of these are white people. They don't read the Washington Post, they don't read the New York Times, they don't read the Chicago Tribune, they don't read the Boston Globe, where they may find out some of the true facts about Obamacare. Grassroots organizations around the country were going in, knocking on doors in white communities, rural communities, black communities, Hispanic communities, knocking on doors and explaining how the Republican health care bill will take away all the things that they need for health care. That turned things around completely, you know. What I'm saying, there are possibilities out there for coalition politics to bring together antagonistic groups. Framing is so very important. It can be done. I'm sorry, it sounded like a
Bill Wilson for president. That's what I'm talking about. Genevieve.
It's hard to follow that wonderful act. But my question has to do with the relationship between the messages and the actions of the politicians. So have you followed timelines of people that run on a certain platform and then you see, the kind of implicit or explicit messages that they have, and then how they act once they get into Congress?
I feel like that's the sort of next step to see how governance works, and I'm sure, I think, at least, that Professor Bobo would maybe argue that Obama, in his second term, maybe dialed back some of that rhetoric and was maybe more willing to sort of embrace quote-unquote Black issues or Black interests, things like My Brother's Keeper, some of his policy around mass incarceration. So there's something to be said that maybe when the electoral stakes are not as high, or maybe when you're not or maybe when you are a lame duck president, for example, that you might have more latitude to govern maybe differently than some of the rhetoric might have suggested.
So I don't know enough about the details of the American experience, but it seems to me that I have two-part question. The first is your message and your central conclusion is quite depressing.
It's quite
depressing. It simply suggests that if you're a Black political candidate competing in an election, that it pays you politically to play to implicit racial prejudices, because that may win you certain votes, particularly in certain categories of voters. That's what it says, it seems to me. The counter message that is being put forward, and you've given some empirical evidence for that, and you've put some of those numbers down. The counter message that is being suggested is that actually you could frame the message slightly differently. That the trick is to create a class universalist message, that it's the problem is political and economic policies, and that if you could build bridges, that actually it might appeal to white working class voters as much as it appeals to Black working class voters. And it seems to me that the interesting possibility that it creates for your research is, could you, if you like, develop a research methodology, a survey methodology that tests the second case? Because now, if you can test the second case and your evidence is fundamentally different, you can then say that there is some empirical logic to that. And that's why the message doesn't have to be as depressing, or the conclusion doesn't have to be as depressing as is suggested, because it opens up other opportunities. That the message is that you don't have to play to racial prejudices, that you could reimagine the framing and come out with, if you like, a universalist agenda, even if you're a Black candidate. That's what it seems to me that debate opens up, and it would be useful to test for it. The second question was to come back to Skip's class dynamics, because I thought that touched on something fairly important. Now, in your sample, you suggested that the median wage we were looking at, income we were looking at, it was between 60 and 70,000. Does that not suggest that the sample, or at least people are reading this from their socioeconomic status? They read it in particular ways. And so these messages that you formulate as reflective of how racial groups react to issues could effectively be socioeconomic groups reacting to issues. And that would mean disaggregating how economic categories responded to these messages in different ways. Now, you just didn't give us enough information on that criteria, and I wonder whether there's some lessons to be learned from that.
Okay, so to your first point about testing the universal message, I mentioned earlier that I don't present it here, but I do have a study where I test, it's a get out the vote message, so it's a little different, but it's like, oh, we can all do this together. It's very universal. Let's work together. And then there's another one that invokes, frankly, some rhetoric from Obama that's like, Cousin Pookie needs to get off the couch and go and vote. And Cousin Pookie get off the couch and vote was more effective than let's all do this together and go vote. So this is in a lab setting, I will say, so it's very controlled. It's not in the real world where people have lots of competing factors, and perhaps maybe it would work better in the real world setting, right? Like there's trade-offs with the experiment. I can tightly control things, but obviously this is not how people are receiving messages in the real world. That being said, my empirical evidence, as depressing as it is, and I think as resistant as people are to hearing this, the universal message was not as effective as a message that played to stereotypes of blacks with my evidence. The second point being, I think you were asking about class differences in terms of maybe how people are responding to the message. These data are still fairly new, so I haven't looked at, say, differences between, say, college-educated whites and non-college-educated whites. But one thing that I would like to say, and we were actually discussing this a bit before the talk, is that I think when we talk about the autopsy for the 2016 election, there's been a lot of this discussion about like, oh, working class whites, he was really able to mobilize those people. And yes, he was able to. He won a larger share of working class whites than, say, like Romney in 2012. That being said, Trump also won the plurality of college-educated whites. And so I think it's very easy, particularly in a space like Harvard, or everyone maybe not everyone, but like people see themselves as progressive, as racial liberals, to get duped into thinking, well, it's those working class white people, like if only we could get them to see their interests. No, like there's people with degrees, some Ivy League degrees, who are quite willing to support a candidate like Trump. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we kind of paint it as like, oh, it's just those uneducated, sort of unwashed masses who could get behind a guy like that.
Yeah, I think Trump won every category of white people in America. I mean, it's astonishing, and I wouldn't have believed it the morning of the election, but, that's where we are. Still, class matters, and we have a very difficult time talking about that, as you can see. Larry and I team teach Intro to AAAS, and we debate it every week. Talking about where class trumps race, or how class intervenes with race. Obviously, I lean toward class difference being important, and we have to be mindful of them. And obviously, Larry is more of a 99% of black people vote for Barack Obama. So the bottom line is race. So it's.
I have to clarify some of these.
All right, go ahead. To your mother, is your mother Mrs.
Collins?
Mrs. Collins?
Yeah, Mom.
Mrs. Collins, I just want you to say, to know, this is the greatest sociologist in the 20th century America. He has never spoken this much. I've been here 26 years. He has never spoken this much. He's like Jesse Jackson today or something. Go ahead, Professor Wilson.
Look, if you look at the voting statistics, it's not true that a majority, maybe you didn't say this, of educated
I said plurality.
whites. Oh, plurality.
I said the plurality.
Okay, plurality.
I didn't say, yeah.
But here's I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Plurality is fine.
Meaning the most, not the 50% plus one, sorry.
Of white people?
Yeah.
I said majority, so I'm the culprit. Right.
Look,
I'm a literate.
Trump voters, if you look at it closely, educated white voters did not support Donald Trump. That is, those with a college education. Just go back and check. The Trump supporters, look it up.
They split for
Yeah,
Trump
but-
and Clinton.
Yeah, but
he
what I'm
still wanted
saying is
plurality.
that a majority, if you look at it, a majority of educated by those with BA degrees, white voters, did not support Trump. A minority of white voters who are college educated supported Trump. Just double check.
I'll double check.
Now here's a point. Trump voters tended to be concentrated in white segregated enclaves that featured little intergenerational mobility, high rates of middle-age mortality, opioid addiction, high dependence on Social Security, disability, and so on. You know, these are segregated white enclaves that voted overwhelmingly for Trump.
That's
And,
true.
Yeah, so I mean, I just think, but that's a kind of a
They
blanket.
weren't the only white people.
No, but I'm saying,
College women white women voted for Trump, right?
Yes.
if you're talking about Republican educated,
I mean, overall, this is just what I'm.
No.
I don't know. I'm not.
no.
But
No.
Lafleur, don't you think so?
Yes.
I mean, you have to
so,
disagree.
I mean, I don't have the stats at hand, but my understanding is that the plurality, he split the white vote of college-educated whites, and he outperformed recent candidates, black, white, Democratic, with working-class whites. So yes, he did very, very well with those people, and he got them mobilized and excited and to participate. But to suggest that college-educated whites, a significant fraction, or the plurality of them did not, basically neither Trump nor Clinton won 50+1 of the white vote. But Trump still, I think, carried maybe 42 to 43% or something. He outperformed Clinton with college-educated whites, but a significant fraction of college-educated whites also voted for Trump.
That I agree with.
Okay.
A significant
So we
fraction,
agree.
but it seemed to me you go to just say across the board, whites voted for Trump.
Well, he won every okay. He did win every
But
demographic
they were
category.
really concentrated in these white enclaves that featured lots of problems.
Like West Virginia, my home state.
Right.
Okay, Bill, you send the stats.
Okay.
I will share them with all the thumbs.
Thank you.
But I will fact check them with her first. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and it's snowing.
Oh, yeah.
But for the fellas, I know you're going back for lunch. And Bill, I want you to, President Backout is coming to the Hutchins Center at 3.
Unfortunately, I got to go work on my lecture tomorrow.
You got to go?
Yeah, I
Can't
got
make
to
it
go
up.
work on my lecture.
Can't make it guess. So when you're leaving, I bring this guy by. That's the new president. So, as soon as I go, you can go home. I don't care. But this is a wonderful presentation, everyone.
Thank you. No, it was fun. I enjoyed it.